At 90 years old, renowned televangelist Jimmy Swaggart passed away, leaving behind a profound legacy that touched millions across the globe. Known for his passionate preaching, soul-stirring gospel music, and unshakable message of grace and redemption, Jimmy's life was one of both triumph and vulnerability. His emotional funeral service became a powerful tribute, not just to a man, but to a lifetime devoted to spreading the gospel. From heartfelt hymns to stories of lives forever changed, the service reflected the deep impact he made across generations. Family, friends, and faithful followers gathered in person and online to bid farewell to a voice that had led many to hope, healing, and salvation. Watch this moving celebration of a life well lived. Pilgrims from across the nation and the world. As the hours passed, the crowd outside the family worship center swelled. Some had driven from nearby towns, while others had flown in from across the country. Some from as far away as South America and parts of Europe, where Jimmy's broadcasts had once aired regularly. These were not curious onlookers. They were not casual fans. They were people who had been shaped by his words, steadied by his music, and inspired by his passion. For many, this was not a public event, it was deeply personal. They weren't saying goodbye to a distant religious figure. They were saying goodbye to someone they had come to view as a spiritual father, a familiar companion during long, lonely nights, a guide who had pointed them toward grace when they had been lost. Among the crowd were elderly couples who remembered the tent revivals of the 1960s and 70s, young pastors who had patterned their sermons after his fiery style, and middle-aged believers who recalled sitting with their parents around glowing TV sets, watching Jimmy preach as if he were sitting right there in their living rooms. The sanctuary, a room steeped in history. Inside the sanctuary, the atmosphere was thick with reverence. The family worship center, where Jimmy had preached for decades, had been carefully prepared. It was the same stage where his sermons had reached global audiences, where his piano had accompanied countless hymns, where his voice had stirred revival after revival. But today the pulpit stood empty. Instead, at the center of the stage, a single casket rested, a simple, elegant vessel draped in white flowers. It was a modest tribute for a man whose ministry had once reached millions, but it was exactly the way he would have wanted it, focused not on grandeur, but on God. Behind the casket, the golden cross that had anchored his televised broadcasts for years gleamed softly under the sanctuary lights, unchanged, a silent sentinel that had watched over his ministry, and now over his final farewell. Every seat in the sanctuary was filled. Every aisle was lined. The walls that had once echoed with Jimmy's booming voice now held the quiet sobs of those gathered to remember him. Some clutched worn Bibles gifted from his ministry. Others held tissues or the hands of loved ones as they prepared to say goodbye to the man who had walked with them through their most intimate spiritual journeys. A global farewell, streaming across the world. Though the family worship center could only hold a finite number of mourners, the impact of Jimmy Swaggart's life stretched far beyond the walls of the church. Thanks to the power of modern technology, his funeral was broadcast live across the globe, enabling thousands, if not millions, to join in mourning, remembrance, and celebration from their own homes, churches, and community halls. In small towns scattered across America, families and friends gathered around televisions and computer screens, their faces reflecting the solemnity of the moment. Communities that had once received his ministry's broadcasts in fragments now experienced the ceremony together, united despite physical distance. In remote villages in Africa, South America, and Asia, where the reach of his gospel ministry had long penetrated despite limited resources, believers quietly tuned in on smartphones, tablets, and laptops. There, under open skies and flickering lamplight, people whispered prayers and shed tears as they recalled the man whose voice had brought them hope when few others had. One particularly moving image came from a correctional facility where several former inmates, men and women, who had found faith through Jimmy's televised sermons during their darkest hours, watched the funeral service in small groups. Many wept in silence, remembering the preacher who had proclaimed the possibility of redemption when they believed themselves beyond saving. For them, this moment was intensely personal. a life that touched generations. The people gathered that day, both physically and virtually, represented a remarkable spectrum of generations. Some were elderly men and women who had first encountered Jimmy Swaggart in the fervent revivals of the 1970s. Those were days when Jimmy, armed only with his Bible and piano, traveled tirelessly from town to town, preaching under large canvas tents to crowds hungry for an authentic encounter with God. Others knew him from the television ministry he built over decades, broadcasts that filled Sunday mornings in millions of homes across the United States and beyond. For these viewers, Jimmy was a weekly fixture, a spiritual guide whose sermons and songs had become part of the fabric of their faith. Younger attendees, some born long after Jimmy's most public years, had discovered his music and messages through the oral tradition of family. Passed down like cherished heirlooms, his recordings were treasured gifts from parents and grandparents. His songs were more than just melodies. They were spiritual legacies, invocations of hope, healing, and faith that transcended age, culture, and geography. The enduring power of his voice, soft yet piercing, broken yet hopeful, carried across the decades. It was a voice that had comforted, challenged, and inspired, and though it now rested in silence, its echoes remained vivid in the hearts and minds of those who gathered to honor him. Remembering the man, not the myth. As people shared memories throughout the day, a clear theme emerged. They had come not to memorialize a myth, but to remember the man himself, flaws, struggles, and all. They recalled the rawness of Jimmy's sermons, the way he laid bare his own imperfections and failures with a rare transparency that made his message accessible and real. Many remembered moments when his voice broke during a song, not out of performance, but because the presence of God had overwhelmed him. They spoke of his trembling hands raised in worship, and the way he never seemed to preach or sing for show, but as a heartfelt plea from one human soul to another. Jimmy's public life had been punctuated by stumbles and controversies, some very public. Yet what endeared him to so many was not that he was without fault, but that he never stopped returning to the pulpit. He came back, not with pride or pretense, but with a humility born of brokenness and a willingness to serve even when imperfect. That relentless clinging to grace, that perseverance in faith was his true legacy. The quiet power of the moment. The funeral itself was intentionally simple, stripped of the elaborate productions and grandeur that often accompany high-profile ceremonies. The family desired a service that felt intimate, personal, and deeply heartfelt. An atmosphere that reflected the sincerity and humility of the man being honored. Soft hymns filled the room, songs Jimmy had sung 1,000 times before, familiar notes that brought comfort without needing grand gestures. There were no dramatic eulogies. No one tried to sum up a life so full and complex in mere words. Instead, the service was more like the closing of a sacred book, its pages worn and weathered, yet filled with stories of countless lives touched and transformed. Some who attended later said it felt less like a funeral and more like a holy farewell, a quiet, sacred moment that acknowledged an ending, but also celebrated the eternal life promised through faith. The collective. Goodbye. As the funeral service drew to a close, there was no rush to leave. The sanctuary, though filled with the soft sounds of people shifting in their seats and the occasional quiet sob, became a sacred space where time seemed to slow. Many chose to linger, unwilling to break the silence that had settled over the room like a tender blanket. It was as if the finality of the moment was too heavy to walk away from. Some mourners sat quietly in their pews, reflecting, praying, or simply remembering. Others rose slowly and began making their way toward the casket that held not just the body of Jimmy Swaggart, but the culmination of a life that had shaped countless souls. One by one, they approached, whispering final words. Intimate goodbyes meant only for the man who had once spoken so directly into their lives. Some brushed the edge of the casket with trembling hands, reluctant to let go, needing that last, fragile connection. The weight of grief was tangible, yet it was balanced by something gentler, a quiet gratitude. Among them was an elderly man, his weathered face streaked with tears that traced the lines of a life undoubtedly touched by hardship. He stepped forward and placed a small worn cassette tape atop the casket, a recording of one of Jimmy's earliest sermons. It was a deeply personal offering, a humble symbol of what that voice had meant to him in his own journey of faith. The gesture was small, but it spoke volumes, a final gift to a preacher who had once given him hope. A voice that lingers when the sanctuary eventually emptied, when the last mourners stepped into the sunlight outside. Jimmy Swaggart's voice did not fade. His sermons continued to air on radio stations and television broadcasts around the world. His songs, long preserved in dusty records, CDs, and now digital streams, continued to rise softly, reverently, in church services, prayer meetings, and the quiet corners of living rooms. His legacy did not exist merely in the physical structures he had built or the ministries he had founded. It lived in the stories, the changed hearts, and the persistent sound of his voice, one that had been present during hospital vigils, late-night drives, long seasons of loneliness, and ordinary Sunday mornings where faith quietly took root. For many who had never met him face-to-face, the loss felt deeply personal. His voice had been a companion, a steady presence, a comfort that met them in the moments they needed it most. In his passing, it wasn't just a preacher the world had lost. It was the familiarity of a voice that had somehow become part of their own life story. A life remembered, a faith continued. The day of Jimmy Swaggart's funeral will be remembered not for grand displays or public spectacle, but for the intimacy of collective mourning. It will be remembered as a moment when thousands came together across continents, generations, and backgrounds to honor a man whose life had always pointed others towards something higher than himself. Those who attended, whether in person or through a screen, did not leave empty. They left filled with stories, with memories, with reminders. They left reminded of grace, of the power of second chances, of a voice that refused to be silenced even when life offered every reason to quit. Jimmy's departure from this world was not a quiet ending. It was a handoff, a passing of the torch to those who remained. His echo continued, not only in the pages of worn Bibles or in the familiar hymns that drifted from church choirs, but in the whispered prayers of those who had first found faith because of his words. His race was finished, his journey complete. Yet for those who gathered to say goodbye, the legacy of Jimmy Swaggart was not something to be buried. It was something to be carried forward. And so they carried it, quietly, faithfully, with gratitude. The service begins, a hymn and a heartfelt gathering. The sanctuary of Family Worship Center was filled to capacity. The air was thick with both reverence and sorrow as people from all walks of life gathered to honor the man whose voice had once thundered across revival tents, television screens, and stadiums around the world. Jimmy Swaggart. Friends, family, longtime congregants, musicians, and strangers, touched by his ministry, sat side by side, united by a common thread: the undeniable impact this man had on their lives. The service opened gently, beginning with a hymn that Jimmy had loved dearly, "Jesus, Hold My Hand." The familiar strains of the melody drifted softly from the choir, whose voices, though steady, occasionally trembled under the weight of their own emotions. As the congregation joined in, many could be seen whispering the lyrics through tears, clinging to the comfort of the words that had accompanied them through both joyous and trying times. The hymn, one Jimmy had sung countless times in his ministry, now took on a deeper, almost sacred meaning. It had become their prayer for him. A son's tribute, the voice of Donnie Swaggart. Donnie Swaggart stepped forward, the son of the man they were there to remember. His face, usually resolute from years in the pulpit himself, now betrayed his grief. His voice trembled, yet there was a quiet strength as he spoke. "He wasn't just my father," Donnie began, pausing to steady his breath. "He was my pastor, my mentor, my hero." His words resonated throughout the hall. Donnie painted a vivid portrait of a man who was larger than life, in the eyes of many, yet deeply personal in his own world. A man who had taught his son not just how to stand behind the sacred desk, but how to live with conviction, how to rise after failure, and how to hold on to faith even when storms raged. Through tears and faint smiles, Donnie shared tender, intimate stories, moments of laughter during long ministry road trips, quiet conversations late at night, and lessons imparted not just through sermons, but through the resilience of a life lived fully, honestly, and imperfectly. His words were not polished eulogies. They were raw, deeply personal memories that allowed everyone in the room to see Jimmy not as a public figure, but as a father, a friend, and a man. A tapestry of tributes, friends, musicians, and ministry partners. One by one, others came forward to speak, longtime friends, fellow pastors, and musicians who had traveled with Jimmy for decades. Each speaker revealed a different facet of a multifaceted life. One pastor recounted the fire of Jimmy's early tent revivals in the 1970s, where crowds overflowed into the streets, drawn not by spectacle, but by the passionate call to redemption. Another, a musician who had toured with Jimmy, recalled nights when, after singing and preaching to thousands, Jimmy would return to his hotel room, sit at the piano, and play softly, often in tears, overwhelmed by the burden he carried for the souls he had just ministered to. A well-known gospel singer then took the stage to perform "I'll Never Be Lonely Again," one of Jimmy's most beloved songs. The room fell into a hushed reverence, broken only by the soft sobs of those who had, at some point, found comfort in the very song. For many, the lyrics had carried them through seasons of loneliness, despair, and doubt. And now, in this final moment, the song seemed to offer them comfort once more. Francis Swaggart's Farewell, Gratitude Over Grief. Then came the most poignant moment of the service. Francis Swaggart, Jimmy's wife and lifelong ministry partner, rose to speak. Her frame was delicate, her hands clasped tightly, but there was undeniable strength in her voice. She stood beside her husband's casket, facing the congregation, not in the posture of a widow consumed by grief, but as a woman brimming with gratitude. "He wasn't perfect," she began, her voice cracking slightly, "and he never claimed to be. But he loved God with everything he had. He loved his family, and he loved all of you." The simplicity and honesty of her words cut deeply. Francis spoke about Jimmy's decades of ministry, not as a record of accomplishments, but as the story of a man who had given everything to the calling placed on his life. "He gave his life on this altar," she said, resting her hand gently on the polished wood of the casket. "And now he's gone to the throne he preached about for 70 years. The closing hymn, Faith Meets Farewell. As the final song of the service began, "I'll Fly Away," the atmosphere transformed. The congregation rose to their feet, many lifting their hands in worship, others swaying gently as though their movements could help carry Jimmy's spirit heavenward. The song, long associated with hope, freedom, and eternal life, filled the room with a powerful unity that transcended sorrow. It was not just a goodbye, it was a celebration of a life of purpose, of a journey completed. Even as the last note faded, few rushed to leave. Many remained seated, lost in silent reflection. Others slowly made their way past the casket, some whispering private prayers, others reaching out to touch the edge of it with trembling hands. The weight of the moment settled over them like a sacred hush. This wasn't just the end of a man's life. It felt like the closing of a spiritual era. Stories that linger, the days that followed. In the days following the service, a flood of memories and stories began to emerge. They came from family members, churchgoers, former ministry partners, and even strangers whose lives had been forever changed by Jimmy's words and music. Some spoke of his fiery revivals in the 1970s, when makeshift tents could no longer contain the crowds and the Spirit moved with palpable power. Others remembered his televised sermons, which pierced through barriers of distance and circumstance, bringing the gospel into prisons, hospital rooms, and far-flung villages. One woman, standing quietly outside the church after the service, held a worn, faded Bible in her hands. Through her tears, she whispered, "I was in the darkest place of my life. He didn't know me, but his words saved me." Her story was just one among thousands, each a thread in the vast tapestry of Jimmy's influence. The Memorial Montage, a life remembered. Later that week, during the memorial service at Family Worship Center, a video montage was played. It wasn't flashy or grand. It was simple, honest, and profoundly moving. The footage transported viewers back to Jimmy's early years, preaching on dusty roadside corners, playing piano with uncontainable joy, baptizing believers in rivers and lakes. There were moments from massive revival meetings, his face lifted heavenward in song, eyes closed, lost in worship. But there were also quieter, never-before-seen clips, hugging children after services, weeping in prayer over letters sent by desperate strangers, and walking alone through the empty sanctuary after Sunday services, laying his hands on each pew and whispering blessings over the people who would one day sit there. In one segment, Jimmy's voice, soft and reflective, offered a simple prayer. If I have one prayer left before I go, it's that people know Jesus, not through me, but through the mercy I've preached about my whole life. That unscripted moment resonated deeply. It was not for an audience, it was his heart laid bare. A private farewell. The burial. The day of Jimmy's burial arrived under a soft, overcast sky, the sun occasionally peeking through the clouds as though heaven itself watched over the gathering. It was a private ceremony, attended by family, close friends, church staff, and longtime ministry partners. The gravesite was modest, nestled among tall trees not far from the church grounds, where Jimmy had spent most of his life preaching, singing, and serving. It had not been chosen for grandeur, but for love, for closeness, for home. There was no elaborate sermon, no dramatic farewell, just quiet prayers, whispered goodbyes, and the soft rustling of wind through the trees. One of Jimmy's oldest friends stepped forward, his voice thick with emotion. He always said he didn't want to be remembered for being on TV, he said, pausing to gather himself. He wanted to be remembered for pointing people to Jesus. Then, smiling faintly through tears, he added, and I think he got his wish. A small choir sang, "There's a River," one of Jimmy's favorite hymns. The familiar melody, sung by countless choirs and congregations throughout his ministry, now became the anthem of his final earthly chapter. Foundations laid by faith and family. Though Jimmy Swaggart's earthly journey had come to a close, the roots of his life's work remained deeply embedded in the ministry, music, and teachings he had dedicated nearly a century to. His family, led by his devoted wife Frances, took up the mantle to ensure that his legacy would not only be remembered, but would continue to grow and inspire generations to come. Just a week after Jimmy's burial, Frances Swaggart stood before a gathered crowd and announced a significant new chapter: the launch of the Jimmy Swaggart Legacy Fund, a memorial foundation created in honor of her late husband. The fund was designed with a clear and noble mission: to provide Bibles, gospel materials, and financial support to struggling churches and ministries around the world, especially those located in underprivileged and marginalized regions.